Thank you so much for a lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here today. This promises to be a magnificent session with a man who has served in so many roles throughout his public career, is one of the finest public intellectuals that we have today. Apart from wearing, albeit very lightly, a very rich ancestral mantle, that of being the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi on his father's side and C. Rajagopalachari on his mother's side. I want to start straight off by asking you, sir, it was Rajaji who essentially first advised you to sort of grapple with the realities of life before you could actually start writing about life. And you sort of moved towards sitting for the civil service examinations. What did your time in the civil services teach you about the multitudes that India contains?
I must thank you and the lady who's introduced us for the very generous introduction, and also to say that it has been my lot for the 80 years that I have been around to be introduced as the grandson of so-and-so and so-and-so. Nothing else seems to matter to anyone. But I want to also say that as far as I am concerned, my most heartwarming introduction is not that of a grandson, but of a grandfather of 3 granddaughters who are my very life. And a more pertinent introduction is something which you might have guessed from what I have been doing, fidgeting with that little gadget. I don't hear as well as I used to. And in order not to have Narayani repeat her questions, I put a little mic in front of her to help me understand what she is saying. To answer your question, Narayani, my entering the civil service, as it is generally called, or the Indian Administrative Service, was really about the most important thing that happened to me, and the most nerve-wracking as well. And as I say this, I should also say that not in the interview board which I faced, but in another interview board a little earlier than that was Narayani's great-grandfather, Sardar K.M. Panikkar. And he was...
VP Menon, actually, sir. VP Menon was my great-grandfather. K.M. Panikkar is who
VP Menon was not on the board which I am referring to. But Sardar Panikkar was, and he was quite a terror. And I was told that he asked questions which had no meaning before he asked questions which had meaning. And one of his favorite questions was, what is the difference between Russian metaphysics and Chinese meteorology? And the person would have no answer to give. Yes, go on, don't you know the difference? He expected the candidate to say, there is no difference. There is no such thing. Your question is absurd. But nobody dared to ask that question. And then I was told, the door in the interview room used to open inward. And very often the candidate would press the door outward while going out. So he would say, pull it harder, pull it harder. So the candidate should have really turned around and said, I'm sorry, you're asking me to do something which is wrong, but no. And yet, Sardar Panikkar was very sharp in the questions he asked with serious intent and very generous with the evaluations that he made. So Sardar Panikkar, in a sense, was for entrance in the Indian civil service not just an interviewer, but a kind of trainer. He trained us for the rough along with the not so rough. He made us see that administration requires the guts to say to whoever, including the public, sorry, you are wrong. There is such a thing called courage. That is what Sardar Panikkar taught us. And that is what so many of us have tried to follow. So many like me have tried to follow it without much success.
That's wonderful. Since we are on the subject of notable people, you've encountered some legends in your public career. Some of the ones that come to my mind are MS Subbulakshmi, JP Narayan, T.N. Seshan, also in The Undying Light is somebody you've written about. What are some of the memories that you have of the kind of people that you've met?
Subbulakshmi was divinity personified. She sang because she had the gift of song. She also was something which is not often recognized. Something which is not often recognized, which is that she had a very sensitive understanding of human nature. And this is something which came through in the way she dealt with audiences across the country and even across the world. She was a very sensitive human being. Her music, as many of you may have heard, could make her listeners cry. I don't know why tears become so integral to the appreciation of music, but they do. I could barely attend a concert of Subbulakshmi without feeling deeply moved. I don't know much music, but I could see the sensitivity of the singer. That was Subbulakshmi. She was also, in her own life, I think, a combination of sadness, almost sorrow, and of sublimity. There was both in her. When she was singing, she became sublime, but something of the sadness of human life, which was part of her own life, would come through. We don't often realize, Narayani, I'm glad you asked me about Subbulakshmi. We don't often realize that artists, many of who are present here today, they sing or play or act, overcoming great personal difficulties and personal sorrows and personal tragedies. We in the audience have to just find 2 or 3 hours to attend and to listen and to watch. But they, for those 2.5 hours, have to overcome so much in their own personal lives, in their families, in their friends, and put those aside and give of their best. You also mentioned T.N. Seshan. Now, he was a remarkable civil servant. It is Seshan who made the Election Commission an institution which the whole country came to respect, almost to the point of raising it to another 4th or 5th estate, legislature, the judiciary, the executive, and on its own the Election Commission, almost like that. Thank you.
Closer.
I'll try to do that. But Seshan was also, like Subbulakshmi, a human being apart from being a great administrator. And as somebody who has worked under Seshan for a short time, luckily for me, I know that he was not the easiest of bosses. One of the biggest flaws in a civil servant is this sense of being supremely powerful. selflessness and modesty were not Mr. Seshan's characteristics. He had a very high opinion of himself, and that can be very difficult for those who are working under him. And since you have mentioned this, let me say that, and this is not in the book, for if it was in the book, I'd be repeating myself. He was once extremely hard on me. And I went to his office the next morning and said, "Sir, I am not good enough for you. You deserve a better deputy secretary." And this great, powerful man's face just fell. And I could see that those who are strong to the weak can also be very weak when they face the strength of true, unselfish, unmotivated criticism. He just melted. And I almost felt sorry for the man who had been nothing short of a bully to me only a little while ago. So the human being in the artist and the human being in the civil servant is something we should remember. And that will make us, I think, treat them with more realism and compassion. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, sir, for that answer. And you know, since we're talking about the human being in the civil servant, I do want to bring up a particular sort of couple of lines in The Undying Light, where you've written about your own disappointments as far as your career has been concerned. And you've written ambition like, I'm quoting here, ambition like lust intoxicates before it leads you to crash. And age seniors are the most pathetic of crashers. So I just wanted to ask, because this line really stood out for me, is it difficult to be that vulnerable and that honest about yourself when you're writing?
Well, this is a question which I have never been asked before. Is it difficult to be honest about oneself? I think it is necessary to be honest about oneself, but it needs a thought partner. If I am honest about myself to myself, sitting in meditation under a tree, it is of no use. But if there is somebody whom I have hurt, somebody whom I have wronged deliberately or even accidentally, if I am honest about myself to that person and say, sorry, I think that is very important, and that is very difficult. And I want to say here that the persons whom we wrong, the persons whom I have wronged in my life, are those who are nearest and closest to me. It is very easy to say sorry to a person on the road if one has budged his car while driving. Sorry, sir, I'm sorry. It is very difficult to say sorry to one's parent, to one's wife, to one's husband. It is very difficult to seek forgiveness from somebody who is close and whom one has wronged or been hard to. And that is a level of honesty which should be one's ideal. Very difficult to reach. I don't know of too many instances where this has happened. It has happened in epics, in our great epics. But in reality, it has not. We all know, do we not, of somebody who has wronged us and who has not atoned or apologized. Similarly, we also know of somebody we have wronged and not said sorry to. 3 words, simple words, are very difficult to use honestly. Please, thanks, and sorry. If we say please and thanks ritualistically and mechanically, that's all right. One should, but that's not so valuable. But if we say these two, and particularly if we say sorry to somebody honestly, then one feels a kind of self-healing. I am very far away from that ideal.
And so when it comes to, your more political writings, when you look back over 30 years of writing, what do you feel about the India that has been changing through the years? Because it's very different when you're writing, say, at 25. Your writing may be very different in craft, it may be very different in reasoning, it may be very different in perspective or view at 45. And this is based against, you're also writing against a very sort of fluid backdrop of the country changing as well, of different foreign policy challenges, of different domestic issues. How do you assess the many changing tides that India has seen through your writing?
Well, my eyes are not so important, but through the eyes of my generation and through the eyes of the generation of my children, I would say this. Today, the dominant emotion in India is of anger, retaliation, demanding an apology, asking for restitution. And in newspapers, the word that you read most often is slam. Mamata slams Amit Shah. Amit Shah slams Mamata. TMC slams Congress. Congress slams BJP. Slam, 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 slam. Spam, scam, and slam. These are the 3 key words of our times. That was not so a generation or 2 generations ago. I think the desire to come to almost blows with the adversary, with the other side, is a very dominant emotion today. Vengeance and hatred are very close cousins. And today, I think, in the marketplace of public opinion and public opinion making, the commodity that is offered for the biggest sale at a discount is animosity, hatred, and spite. Slam. If slam was an object of sale, it would be one of the fastest moving objects today. This is a sign of our generation, and the biggest change, I would say, from the generation of 30, 40 years ago.
I think that's very true. And you've also, in The Undying Light especially, you've talked about the weaponization of history. And you have said, and I'm quoting just one of the questions that you've asked, will history be used in India as a tool for control for political aggrandizement by creating new myths of victimhood or tools for vendetta? So I guess my question is, in 2026, what is the burden for a historian in the immensely digital age that we live in? You know, where there's swathes of mass fake information, there's artificial intelligence, there is a deliberate attempt to distort history. What makes 2026 more sinister?
Well, I notice the word sinister that you have used. I think there is a lot of sinisterness in our times. Vendetta is a very sinister emotion. Badla is the Hindi word that is very commonly used. Hum badla lenge, badla denge. And it is an endless game. Vendetta and retaliation are virtually endless. We have become retaliatory people. And there is enough evidence to show that this is endless. I really do not know how we will get over this. It is a very long time, and I put this to you, esteemed audience, I put it to you. When did we last hear somebody say, I made a mistake? I made a mistake, an honest mistake. Mistakes are being made all the time, but very few say that. And how long ago is it? When did we last hear somebody say, I forgive you, I forgive you? I can't remember that being said in recent times. Forgiveness is a known emotion, but I have not come across it for a very long time. Forgiveness is regarded almost as naive. Somebody who says forgive somebody would be regarded as a naive person. Bhola aadmi hai. Bholapan is regarded as something which is almost laughable. It is not something which a group of people or any individual who wants to progress in life would want to do. A person who is bhola is regarded as a weakling, whereas, truly speaking, it is not. And since, Narayani, you mentioned the word historian, I would just like to say here, the Emperor Ashoka said sorry. He apologized. And he was not weak by any standards. The Emperor Ashoka, after Kalinga, said, I have made a mistake. I have killed innocents. I apologize. Anushochana is the word he used, remorse. And the same Ashoka, he did not disband the army. He did not abdicate. He remained emperor. He was a very strong emperor. But he said, I am sorry. How many of his population understood that? I do not know. His edicts may not have been read by everyone or even understood by everyone. But that he was honest to himself, another phrase which you used, Narayana, and his atonement are real. In more recent times, in Australia, the Prime Minister of Australia apologized to the original people of Australia, the Aboriginals as they are called. Japan has apologized. Nobusuke Kishi, the Prime Minister of Japan, apologized to all those countries Japan had mutilated during the Second War. And the German Chancellor Willy Brandt, he fell on his knees in Poland at the Warsaw Memorial. He fell on his knees and apologized. And he was a very strong chancellor. He won the election immediately after this. So honesty, apology, atonement are not signs of weakness. All these people from Ashoka onwards are bhola people, but bhola in the sense of knowing their strength and using their strength to say, I have made a mistake. That is missing in our country today. That is missing in the world today. And I do not have to give examples. I do not have to give examples. We know that. We know that all too well.
So, in keeping with, we're talking about the values of humility, we're talking about the importance of it, we're talking about how much has changed. You've sort of mentioned this, you've given the example of the SS India, which was powered by two jets of steam, democratic republicanism and secularism. Do you think that at the present moment, that vessel is either running out of steam or is out of steam? And if so, why?
It is very hard to say why, but I agree with you. It is, that emotion is running out of steam. Now, on a slightly related but different aspect to the same issue, as a country, we are a country of rivers. We are a people of rivers. Nadi. Our country is named after a river. Very few countries are named after rivers. India is among them. Jordan is one, Niger is another. Some towns are named after rivers. Kabul is named after. We are a country. But the partition of India was described yesterday by a very leading scholar from Singapore in Delhi as unnatural. Our country of rivers was partitioned in an unnatural fashion. It cut our rivers. It was unnatural because it also did something else. It made rivers of people. People migrating from one part to the other became rivers, oceans of humanity. Unnatural. And that unnatural condition of the subcontinent of India is today the greatest tragedy of the subcontinent of India. Whether it is in Pakistan or India or what is now Bangladesh and what was East Pakistan from 1947 to 1971. I do not know when that will get corrected. I have no idea when that will be corrected. We are living in a most unnaturally divided country. Forests, rivers, deserts were divided. This desert state of ours is right next to another desert state. The ecology is common, but the Radcliffe line divides it. We are living with a great travesty against nature, ecology, and humanity. And it's a huge challenge. And anyone, anywhere on the subcontinent who tries to say, well, the partition has happened, we can't undo it, but let us not keep the poison of the partition alive. We must take the poison out of the partition, the sting out of that extraordinary trauma. Unless we do that, I'm afraid we are condemning our future generations to endless strife without anybody being prepared to say, I'm sorry, or seek forgiveness. I have this morbid fear that the example of great human beings on the subcontinent who are trying to keep humanity alive despite the partition, that great example is under threat. And yet, I see hope. And Narayani, I'll conclude my answer to your question by saying that hope comes from very unexpected sources. We have this extraordinary javelin thrower, Neeraj, and he hurled this javelin. And there was this Pakistani counterpart of his, whom all of us know of. Neeraj's mother said of the young Pakistani, he also is like my son. He too is like my son. No point of a javelin has reached a philosophical end as Neeraj's mother's response. And I must also say that Gukesh, the great chess wizard, when he lost to the Chinese counterpart, unexpectedly, Gukesh was himself completely flummoxed by his own victory. And he said on world television, Gukesh, of his Chinese counterpart. These are not his exact words, but I know this is exactly what he meant in slightly different words. Gukesh said, I won the game, but he is the hero of this tournament. Extraordinary. These two sportsmen from India have shown that they are statesmen, not just sportsmen.
Thank you, sir. That's a wonderful, wonderful thought, which I want to take forward into my final question to you before we open it up to the audience, which is that in The Undying Light, you've written towards the end of the book that, you know, the light in post-independent India is dimming. It's not dying. I want to ask you about the sense of hope that you just spoken so eloquently about. I want to ask how important that is going forward when we're talking about India and her futures. What are you looking forward to at this point?
I do not believe the light will die, but it is glowing very dim. And we are all told that the fires of hate and the fires of vengeance need to be lit. I see great danger in that. The light of understanding, which is a step towards negotiation, which is not the same thing as capitulation, not at all, but negotiation is crucial, absolutely crucial. And I must say here, something wonderful has happened in this very month of January between India and Pakistan, which has not been reported as much as it should be. By an agreement between the two countries, on the 1st of January every year, India and Pakistan exchange lists of nuclear installations in each other's countries in order to make sure that neither country approaches those installations. With all our difficulties, with everything that terrorism has mutilated, with everything that terrorism has done to spoil our relations, India and Pakistan have exchanged those lists. And another extraordinary thing, India and Pakistan have an agreement by which they exchange lists of prisoners in their countries from the other countries. And in this year, with all our difficulties and the horrible fact of terrorism facing us, India and Pakistan have exchanged lists of prisoners in each other's countries. So that light, which can be called the light of faith and trust and hope, is very active and very alive, even at the level of governments. And I pin my faith on that. And I sincerely hope that a time will come when both countries will see that the grim prospect of non-state players using artificial intelligence to gain a commanding hold over the security situation on the subcontinent will be challenged by that light. I say this very seriously. Non-state players, which is one way of saying terrorists, can use artificial intelligence to reverse everything that is happening by way of progress in our countries. And if that happens, even in the matter of our nuclear installations, nothing can help us. But there is this wisdom in the two countries, which we have seen working this very month, and we must strengthen that wisdom by resolving in our hearts that we cannot feed the fires of hatred, suspicion with the oil of our own internal, what should I say, prejudices. We are home to dangerous prejudices which have to be exorcised.
Thank you so much. May I request Mr. Gandhi's mic to be taken? I'm opening up the floor to the audience. I'm sure there are going to be many questions for Mr. Gandhi.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be just handing over the special mic which Mr. Gandhi uses. You are requested to ask your questions through that.
Let me say that it is not necessary to ask questions. Questions are entirely non-obligatory and voluntary.
Hello, Mr. Gandhi. You just talked about, hope. How do you distinguish between being optimistic that enables the coexistence and the pessimism that is more, realistic? So how do you distinguish them?
Thank you for the question. I am generally not optimistic. And when I am not optimistic, I tell myself, oh, I am being realistic. But that is not so. That is not what is the actual situation. I think the combination of optimism and realism is what Neeraj's mother showed. Optimism and realism. It's also what Gukesh showed. It is also what our two governments have showed. Cautious optimism is realism. And I think we should trust, but against verification. We cannot trust in some childish way, that we have to calibrate our trust, but trust we must. There is a hand to the right. Okay.
So good afternoon, sir. My name is Aditya. So, yeah, with this. Dono? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I can hear you.
Yeah. So I really liked your argument about forgiveness and humility, and the fact that you gave examples from all the way from Ashoka to the German Chancellor Willy Brandt. But shouldn't this argument be extended to the British as well? Like the Jallianwala Bagh, the Rowlatt Act, the sending of millions of Indian soldiers to fight wars that they had no business fighting. So I believe, along with the problem of not having humility, there is also the concern, a very big concern of historical amnesia in India. Like certain facts are being forgotten, and unless that is dealt with, meaningful relations and even friendships in the present won't be fully sustainable. To forgive also, you have to, remember what all happened and deal with things. So yeah, I'd like to hear your opinion about that.
I think it's very important for us to remember the horrors of the British Raj. It is very important that we do not forget them. But it is also very important for us to know that apology, when demanded and even when given, is not apology. An apology that is demanded and received at gunpoint is extortion. It's not apology. The real apology comes unsolicited. And when the Archbishop of Canterbury at Jallianwala Bagh prostrated before the monument, I think a sincere apology was given. But for us to say that the king or the prime minister or the queen must apologize is understandable, but it does not belong to the vocabulary of apology. I must also say here that history heals in ways which we cannot anticipate. Who would have thought that Britain would have a prime minister with the name Rishi Sunak? Who would have thought that in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, a large number of Indians, Hindu and Muslim and Sikh, would take their place and speak on the world and in international relations as well as India and British relations. To scratch at a wound does not heal. And I think we must know that history can heal what humans prevent from being healed, given time.
So I think there's a question here.
Hello, sir. Sir, thanks for giving us the information, how naturally our country has been partitioned. I never saw it from that lens, dividing rivers, mountains, And so one thing, don't you feel ki most of the time common man's emotions are guided by the political will? Because the more we criticize each other, we are termed as patriotic. And if we praise each other, we are termed as non-patriotic these days. So when the political will decide our emotion, how can a common man express, his own will and emotions, for anything better?
The partition of India is a fact of history. And I don't think it is anybody's case that the partition should be reversed. But there are things which are indivisible in and on the subcontinent of India. And those indivisibilities are to be seen and nourished and cherished by us. Those who demanded and got the partition of India were, in my view, misguided and extraordinarily narrow, and have placed the people of this subcontinent on the permanent razor's edge of collapse. It is the higher wisdom of, I would say, the people of the Indian part of the subcontinent that must prevent that collapse. We can, and I believe will do it, if only to save the future generations from two major tragedies, and I'll finish with that. I want to talk about Ladakh, the topmost, northernmost part of India. Due to what humanity, what we have done, global warming has denuded Ladakh of its ice cover. The seasons have changed in Ladakh. It is very cold there now, but drought faces Ladakh. The rivers of India, as said, are India. We are a land of rivers. But our rivers are drying up. Snowmelt is gone. Rainfall is unpredictable. We, the people of rivers, are seeing our rivers either polluted or dried or dying. The Yamuna has probably crossed the limit. And at the same time, the rivers of humans that I spoke of, the massive movements of people shaken by communal frenzy, those are another reality of another kind of rivers. We have to be river-minded to protect the natural rivers and prevent the unnatural rivers from ravaging our country. That is the duty of the people of a country named after a sacred river and which holds other rivers equally sacred. This is what I would like to end our conversation with today.
Thank you. I think we are all out of time at this point. Mr. Gandhi is very much around. He will be signing books close by. If you have any further questions for him, you can find him there. And please buy both copies of The Undying Light and India and Its Futures. I promise you, it's more than worth your time. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you, Mr. Gandhi.
We would like to thank Gopal Krishna Gandhi and Narayani Basu for such an enchanting session. Ma'am, we would like you to accept this scarf from us. We would like to thank Rajasthan Patrika for presenting this session. The authors will be signing their books at the book signing desk located at the right-hand side of the Vedanta front lawn. Don't miss the opportunity to have your book signed. You can get the authors' books at the Crossword bookstore located right behind you people in front lawn. Our festival bookstore partner Crossword will be selling at kiosks in front of every venue. To view this session and many more, please tune in to the official Jaipur Literature Festival YouTube channel. All our sessions and related content will be available there. So be sure to like and subscribe. Please help us in keeping the festival venues clean and dispose of your waste in the waste bins placed across Vedanta front lawn.